stories about witches. Is it true what they say?
So, as a guy who has sacrificed an embarrassing amount of hours at the altar of The Witcher in its various incarnations, I naturally have a lot to say about Netflix's adaptation of the series. But I'll start with this. Despite the divisive critical reception as well as some dissent from staunch fans of the property, which I'll address later, I'm happy to report that it's an excellent show. No, it's not perfect, but art never is, and yes, they tinkered a little with the source material, which is a contentious reality for most adaptations. But while I didn't love some of the resulting changes, I found many to be necessary to serve the story they set out to tell. Nevertheless, this endeavour was always going to be a monumental task. The source material itself issues inherent challenges to adaptation because of its format and scattered origin stories, but we're also living in a post-Game of Thrones world where everything fantasy must compare to that juggernaut. However, for critics, it apparently doesn't matter if they're narratively comparable or not, or in some instances, it doesn't matter if they've actually watched it or not. Make no mistake, it was inevitable that they be compared, but I find most comparisons by critics in particular to be a literary crutch devoid of creativity, and I'll clarify why later in this video. But despite this, the show has unquestionably found its audience. According to Para Analytics, it debuted as the third most in-demand original streaming service in the US, with only Stranger Things and The Mandalorian beating it out. That's good company. And ultimately, I think the entire crew deserved praise for the final product, even if there were a few bumps along the way. But let me explain why. Before we move on, I'll be avoiding potential spoilers for season 2 and beyond, but in mentioning changes from the books to the show, there could be a few minor hints to the future. They won't be hugely consequential, but if you want to avoid them entirely, I'll give you a warning and you can skip ahead. Also, be sure to stay tuned in until the end of this video for my theory on why critics generally dislike the series while fans love it. But let's get into this. For those who are uninitiated, The Witcher is a fantasy series based on a collection of short stories and novels by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski. They famously spawned the award-winning video games of the same name, and now this Netflix production created by showrunner Lauren Schmidt-Histrick. But before I break this monster down, let me introduce myself and share my standing in the world of Witcher fandom, because I think it's vital that you understand where my perspective comes from. Okay, so quickly, my name is Rob, and yep, I'm Irish, that's the accent you're hearing. And you might have noticed that this is the first video I've uploaded to this channel, so if you like it, hit the subscribe button. Now on to my Witcher street cred, so to speak. I'll put it like this: if the Witcher lore was a currency, I'd be doing pretty damn well for myself relative to most people who watch the show. To date, I've played, well, overplayed the Witcher video games 1, 2 and 3, and I've read Last Wish, Blood of Elves, Time of Contempt, Baptism of Fire, 3/4 of Tower of Swallows, and a few stories from The Sword of Destiny. I know, I'm slacking, but I'm a busy guy, sorry. So once I finish those, I have The Lady of the Lake and Season of Storms left. Although truth be told, I do know most, if not all, of the major plot points from them already because I'm weak-willed, so there's that. Anyway, suffice to say, going into this Netflix show, I had a preconceived vision, influenced by the source material and augmented by the games, of what it should be. So regardless of the story and characters, they first had to win me over with the world and the tone, and that's not an easy task. Like with any fantasy property, world building is critical, and with an adaptation, the same applies. However, to complicate things, the world must appease those who have experienced it through another medium. And in The Witcher's case, with critically acclaimed books and games, the ask was twofold. But for me, they nailed it. Within minutes, I could tell that the crew intimately knew the world, and it felt like The Witcher. And from a technical perspective, and by that I mean the CGI, monster design, cinematography, score, and fight choreography, I thought they delivered on their promise too. The swordplay in particular was outstanding, as was the score. They felt original, but also felt like they were ripped right out from the game. With that said, some of the monsters, especially the digitally constructed ones, were below par for my taste. And I mean, we can always ask for more, like maybe they could have further explored the process in which one becomes a Witcher, or perhaps delved into the unrest between humans and non-humans a bit more, but I think they handle most of that conflict pretty well. Besides, I suspect that it'll be a more significant plot for season 2. And while this isn't an adaptation of CD Projekt Red's acclaimed video games, I think that they made their contribution in helping the crew devise the world. Those developers did an exceptional job of transferring the books to the screen, and I'd wager that their games, especially Witcher 3, was used as a tool by the crew, from the showrunner right down to the actors, particularly Henry Cavill. He of course played the lead role of Geralt, and you could tell that he was invested in the character, but that's not surprising. It's no secret that he pursued the role because he's such a big fan of the property, so I knew he, at the very least, least understood Geralt's nature. But casting in adaptations can be tricky because for most people, physical resemblance to the character is paramount. And while I think there's merit to that, in most casting situations, I favour sourcing the best actor first, one who will inhabit the character and capture its essence. Then you can worry about their appearance, and in most cases, the makeup department can work their magic there. And I think that Geralt's casting falls firmly into this approach. I can't imagine anybody looking at Superman and thinking that he's physically comparable to the pigment deficient mutant in Geralt. And while I rated Cavill as an actor, I was worried when I saw the teaser trailer where he was wearing the dodgy wig and a half-baked makeup job. Partially because my usual preference of talent first went flying out the window because, fandom. And secondly because Geralt's physical makeup, unlike others, directly serves his character. He's the product of extensive experiments and mutations, so he has to harbour a unique look. His off-kilter appearance is the inciting feature of both fear and bigotry in others. Anyways, my fears were quickly tempered just a few minutes into episode 1. The wig could be improved, sure, but it was better than I expected it to be. His costuming and makeup worked, but crucially, his performance was spot on. I mean, yep, he is still the Gold's Gym sponsored version of the character that we expected, and while that isn't how I pictured him, I can accept that those apothecary protein shakes are potent and move on. I also loved his take on Geralt's vocal inflection, right down to the, come on, say it with me. He said to find a voice he took inspiration from Doug Cockle, the actor behind Geralt's dulcet tones in the game, as well as Peter Kenny, the narrator from the audiobooks who puts a Northern Yorkshire twist on Geralt's baritone. And then he mixed them together with his own accent to land on the rendition that we hear in the show. And I'm relieved that he took this approach because I don't think a simple impression would have worked as well. And that brings me to his co-lead Anya Chalotra, who plays Yennefer. Her casting initially generated some negative press, mainly on account of her age relative to Cavill's, but also because of the inevitable race issue, but more on that later because it was more prominent for other castings. Nevertheless, aside from Cavill's, her performance stood out above the rest for me, and I get the sense that she proved most of her naysayers wrong. And while it certainly helped that she had a lot to sink her teeth into, it was an impressive turn in an undeniably challenging role. Hers was also the most complete character arc of the season. We saw her progression from a nihilistic hunchback to a power-hungry mage, with both sides needing a convincing performance to land safely, and she nailed it. She was electric from start to finish. But I think the writers deserve tons of credit for this too. Her arc in the show, while consistent with the spirit of Sapkowski's work, is entirely original. From the books, we do know her backstory, but we hear it mostly through conversation. It's never actually explored in great detail. And this is one of the main reasons why I stated that the source material issues inherent challenges to adaptation. The short stories from The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny are basically standalone tales which explore Geralt's origins. They don't really have a narrative through line, and they also don't feature Yennefer and especially Ciri in a large capacity. It would have been considerably more manageable for the writers to begin with the novels, which start with Blood of Elves. These have traditional linear narratives, and I have a hunch that it would have satisfied the critics' tastes more. But the crew were committed to adapting the shorts, and I'm glad that they did because I love those stories. However, once they made that decision, they had to figure out how to make those episodic pieces work within a serialized show. And their solution was to develop 3 timelines, one for Geralt, Yennefer and Ciri, which eventually converge into one. And this was arguably the main point of contention for viewers. Looking at the reviews, many people who are new to the property found the multiple timelines confusing and couldn't follow the time jumping. And while that wasn't true for me, I'm not a fair use case because of my prior knowledge of the material, so I get how that could have happened for others. With that said, for what it's worth, I watched it with my girlfriend and she managed to follow it. Although I did tell her that the stories were taking place at different times, which helped her a lot, so I guess they could have held the audience hand a little to fix that issue. Nevertheless, I thought the use of multiple timelines was brilliant for numerous reasons. Firstly, it was fitting from a character development point of view. For this show to work, I feel it was imperative to show Geralt's profession, code and attitude before he gets implicated in destiny and politics. And the shorts are an outstanding primer for that. And also from an artistic standpoint, they cleverly utilise the episodic nature of these stories to highlight one of the show's primary themes. And maybe I'm giving them too much credit for this, but hear me out. A reoccurring criticism of the series is that many of Geralt's adventures seem disconnected from the central story found mainly within Yennefer and Ciri's respective narratives. But that's the point. He's a social pariah, an outcast, and his kind isn't supposed to be involved in the political machinations of kingdoms and mages. But he finds himself caught in their bind anyway through destiny, the overarching theme of the show, despite his journey being seemingly isolated from the rest. And that's clever. Lauren Histrich, the showrunner, confirmed that next season will be very different. It'll be more focused on the central story, which makes perfect sense because it'll adapt the novels which, as I mentioned previously, have a coherent through line, unlike the shorts. Anyway, as far as the rest of the cast goes, I think they did an excellent job finding under the radar talent to fill many of the primary roles. I do, however, have some reservations about a handful of them, but it has little to do with the actors per se. For many people, the decision to cast Mimi Jueni as Fringilla Vigo was controversial because they race swapped the character, but for me personally that wasn't the issue. As I stated earlier, unless a character's appearance is essential to who they are, those kinds of changes don't faze me. But the problems I did have with Fringilla was with her story arc, which is one of the more prominent departures from the source material. Don't get me wrong, if a change serves the story, I'm usually open to it, but I'm not yet convinced by this one. Firstly, Fringilla in the show appears overtly sinister in a way that she wasn't in the books. And while we don't have extensive knowledge of her background, what we do know is that she's from Toussaint, a duchy of Nilfgaard, albeit an autonomous one. So she wasn't sent to Nilfgaard by the chapter because she never went to Artusa, the Hogwarts-like school in the show. She would have attended a Nilfgaardian magic academy. She did, however, fight in the Battle of Sodden Hill on Nilfgaard's side, consistent with her allegiances. Furthermore, in the books, as far as I remember, there's no mention of Nilfgaardian mages using forbidden magic, unlike in the show. They do, however, treat mages rather poorly there, and all of that ties into my primary criticism of the series, Nilfgaard as a whole. In the show, they were depicted as this all-evil force, something akin to the armies of Mordor in The Lord of the Rings. In the books, however, when it comes to war, the classification of heroes and villains is left up to interpretation. Don't get me wrong, to the Northerners like the Cintrans and Temerians, who we primarily view the world through, Nilfgaard is the enemy, so naturally many of the point of view characters are vitriolic about their invaders. But the conflict isn't a black and white issue, but rather one of varying shades of grey. I also felt the same about Cahir as I did Fringilla. He's the Nilfgaardian officer for those who don't remember, but at the risk of getting into spoilers, I'll move on. But before I do, one last thing on Nilfgaard. That armour, it ain't great. Pretty bad actually. Anyway, I won't dig too deep into this Nilfgaardian rabbit hole, but I might explore it in a future video. Ultimately, I just hope that we don't get a generic good versus evil story. And while we're talking about differences from the source material, another physical departure from the book to show was King Foltest. If you don't remember him, he was the king of Temeria and the father of the incestuously conceived Strigga. In the short story The Witcher from the Last Wish, we were introduced to him with the line, quote, "Foltest was slim and had a too pretty face," unquote. And while I don't want to throw shade at the gentleman portraying him, his appearance certainly doesn't match up to that description. But yeah, that wasn't a deal breaker for me, just wanted to point it out. Anyway, I don't want to break down every character today, so let me breeze through the rest of the major players. Freya Allan as Cirilla. I'm convinced. Her story arc once she left Cintra was, for me, the weakest of the three major threads in season 1, but it wasn't bad by any means. Like Yennefer's, much of her story was original to the show because we don't see a lot of her backstory in the books, but it's mostly consistent, albeit with some differences, including how she met Geralt. Nevertheless, her performance, especially when Cintra was under siege, was exceptional. And knowing where her arc will lead into future seasons, I have the utmost confidence in her to knock it out of the park. She gets a lot to do. Jodie May as Queen Calanthe. The shoe fits. The banquet scene where Pavetta, Ciri's mother, is betrothed to Dunny is based on the short story A Question of Price. Her fate was consistent with that in the books, but it's somewhat of a shame because she was brilliant on screen. Bonus trivia, Jodie May played Maggie the Frog in Game of Thrones. Adam Levy as Mousesack. A welcome surprise. I was pleasantly surprised by Levy's performance as the Skelligan Wizard, and while I didn't love the Doppler storyline, everything else was great. Potential small spoiler warning coming. In the books, Mousesack survives the slaughter of Cintra, but as you saw on the show, it looks like he was murdered. Regardless, it shouldn't have any effect on the story going forward because he didn't really reappear for anything of particular significance in the novels. Besides, writing characters out of a story in TV doesn't work as it does in a book. If Mousesack survived and then just disappeared for the rest of the series, or is given very little to do, that might seem a little strange considering his prominent role in season 1. Killing him off might be the way to achieve the same thing without having to explain why he never shows up again. Bonus trivia, he does appear in the Witcher video games, but he's known as Ermion. Anna Schaefer as Triss Merigold. up in the air. I'll reserve final judgment on this one until we get more data. The controversy with her casting was once again appearance related, and while I've explained my position on that earlier, I will admit that it's odd not seeing her with her patented red locks. Regardless, she wasn't given much to do. I think the idea was to simply put her on the chessboard rather than flesh out her character this season, and to do this they introduced her to Geralt earlier by placing her in Temeria with King Foltest. But this isn't necessarily a departure from her origins. She is a staple of King Foltest's royal council, but she doesn't actually appear in that particular story in the books. With all that said, gamers will likely have more affinity for Triss than book readers because her role in the games is actually more prominent than it is in the books. Joey Beatty as Jaskier, pitch perfect. There's not much else to say really. Like in the other works, Jaskier, known as Dandelion in the English translations, contrasts Geralt's stoic exterior with levity, and I thought it worked in the show really well. It helped that he and Henry Cavill had tremendous chemistry too. So yeah, toss a coin to your Witcher. Mayanna Buring as Tissaia de Vries, a highlight. Outside of Geralt and Yennefer, this might be my personal favourite performance of the entire season, because I'll admit that despite being a significant presence in the books, Tissaia was never a character I connected with. However, in the show, Mayanna and the writers brought her to life, and I think that's going to pay off big later on. Bonus trivia, Mayanna Buring isn't a newcomer to the Witcher series. She was actually the voice actor behind Anna Henrietta in the Blood and Wine expansion for Witcher 3. Again, there are a lot of characters that are worth exploring, but I'll keep those for another time, because before I go, I want to address the show's critical reception and the comparisons to Game of Thrones. Firstly, yes, they were inevitable. When you're the next big fantasy series to debut after Thrones ended, it comes with the territory. I mean, Game of Thrones was the first fantasy TV series of its kind to make the genre acceptable to a mainstream audience. However, I have found that most of the comparisons made by critics are both lazy and self-serving. Are there similarities? Yeah, of course there are. They're both sprawling, epic fantasy-based stories littered with the genre's typical tropes, although both subvert them in their own unique way. So I don't blame a casual viewer for picking out those superficial similarities, they are there. However, critics should be held to a higher standard, or else what service are they providing? And you're allowed to dislike things, so I'm not disputing that. But narratively, these shows are vastly different, and if critics can't see that, then maybe they should watch the entire series before reviewing it. And that's not a shot at all critics. Just the one from Entertainment Weekly who reviewed the show, despite admitting that they skipped multiple episodes. That's madness, and I wish that I had those kind of liberties in my job. Anyway, it's not that it's just lazy to compare Game of Thrones and The Witcher. I also think that it's also self-serving in a sense that Game of Thrones will generate interest and clicks, so I feel that that's part of what's happening here. Anyway, I'll let Freya Allen have the last word on this.
I really hope for Ciri to be the next Arya.
She's not going to be the next Arya, she's Ciri. She's very different.
There you go. You got told.
Well said. I also have a theory on why there's a big disparity between critical and audience reception. Thanks to the multiple narratives, the show does benefit from binge watching. And even though I generally prefer episodes to be released weekly, and I'm probably in the minority in that debate, in this case I'm glad Netflix opted to publish them in bulk. Although for reviewers, I think it can have a negative effect. With the whole series available, editors will want their writers' take pronto. They want to be the first to publish to beat out the rest of the traffic for those precious clicks. And I'm not claiming that they're being nefarious here, that's just the nature of the beast. However, I don't think The Witcher with its intricately woven story can be accurately appraised without a period of marination, and most reviewers in this instance didn't get that luxury. But who knows if their opinion would be different if they did. There are many examples of shows released in bulk, yet they still received critical acclaim. But I know from a personal perspective, I needed some time to come to my conclusion about The Witcher, and I can't wait for what season 2 brings us. Thanks for watching the video, and if you've watched it right to the end, you must have liked it, so hit the like button, why not? I had no real intentions of making this, but after watching the season, I really wanted to talk about it, so I just popped on here and yeah, get my thoughts. I'm not sure what I'm gonna do with this channel, but if you like this one and you want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments and subscribe, and maybe I will. Normally I talk about MMA, I have a channel called the MMA Movement, so if you like the UFC, fighting, all that kind of stuff, go check that out. But cheers.